Welcome to today's podcast of Everyone Has the Freedom to Choose. This is Deb King. Join us for today's Cornerstone Conversation. You plus God is enough. There are times I can feel as if I don't have what it takes to fulfill the God-given purpose of my life. Oftentimes I am challenged in climbing the mountain in front of me. All of us can feel this way from time to time. It can be overwhelming at times in helping others in their quest to find or fulfill their God-given purpose and conquer the obstacles they face. In prayer, I told God, I am not who you think I am. I don't have those skills, talents, or strength to do what you are asking of me. Quickly, I was reminded that God knew me before I was being knit together in my mother's womb. Mulling over my mountains and feeling underqualified to do what lay before me, I felt perhaps God might have picked the wrong person. However, I was drawn to the words of Jeremiah. He clarified for me that God knows me very well, more than I know myself. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah 1, verse 5, the English Standard Version. My understanding was strengthened when I read David's words in Psalm 139. He said, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Psalm 139, verses 1 to 5, the English Standard Version. David goes on to say, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Psalm 139, verses 12 to 14, the English Standard Version. We are not the only ones who sometimes feel inadequate to do what God has called or positioned us to do. In doing a study of great leaders who faced an enormity of obstacles within themselves to change the course of history, my study began. One name stood out above others: Moses. Interesting choice, I thought. But when you consider Moses, born a Hebrew, raised Egyptian royalty, always served and obeyed, or the offender would suffer the consequences. To lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt? The terms humble or servant leadership would not come to mind. But God had created Moses with a specific plan for his life, to set God's people free and bring them to the promised land, right? That's what I had thought most of my life. But there was a bigger picture here. There was a deeper meaning to the plan God gave Moses. Moses was to lead the Hebrew people into a right relationship with God so they could go into the promised land. Until age 80, Moses would appear to be the most unlikely candidate for the job. Up until then, he didn't show any attributes, skills, heart, or character to accomplish what God had requested of him. Until the burning bush, he didn't yet have the relationship needed to meet the call. But God knew Moses before he was born. He created Moses for the job. Before Moses was born, God had formed him with everything he needed to be all God planned for him. God knit every fiber of Moses' being, body, soul, and spirit. He wove every gift, talent, ability, and strength within Moses from the start. But God used time, circumstance, and God's one-to-one burgeoning relationship with Moses to mold his characteristics until they were suited to God's purposes. It was an incredible task that lay before Moses. Moses wasn't equipped to lead without an intimate relationship with God. You can't lead where you haven't gone. You can't lead others into a growing and intimate relationship with God if you don't have that connection yourself. In Moses' initial relationship with God, he acknowledged his weaknesses. He made clear to God who he wasn't. He reminded God of his failed past, but God reminded him of his future. God informed Moses that God is and has all Moses needs to accomplish God's intended plan for Moses' life. God used Moses being placed in a basket to be found by royalty and to be called their own. Moses was trained in the best schools in academics, the arts, the world, and war. He was schooled in all proper social and royal etiquette and duties. He was trained in Egyptian gods. He was trained to walk and be the authority. This was Moses' first 40 years, training. His second 40 years was in the desert as a sheep herder, husband and father. He also was son-in-law to the man who was his boss. Moses trained to manage, lead, and care for sheep, knowing what it was to go after the one sheep who was lost. That's when and how he met the God of all gods, the great I Am. In walking out God's instruction to free God's people and lead them to the promised land, Moses learned how to trust and obey God's instructions. He submitted to God's authority. God would give him what he needed to fulfill the plan. Moses needed to understand and embrace his weaknesses and his desperate need for God in the midst of all he was going to do. He knew he couldn't, but God could. But it took an intimacy and a relationship with God, the God who knew him inside and out. God did not change who or what Moses was. He did not give Moses new abilities and strengths. Instead, he took Moses' characteristics and molded them until they suited his purposes. Moses needs to step in, trust God, and go through the tough circumstances to fulfill his God-given purpose and plan for his life. It has been said, leadership often involves reaction. If we want to react with instincts consistent with God's will, we must develop habits of obedience to God. Consistent obedience to God is best developed in times of less stress. Then, when stress comes, our natural reaction will be to obey God. God knew Moses long before he was born. He knit him together in his mother's womb with all that he needed to fulfill his God-given purpose. God is the same for us today. He knew us before he knitted us in our mother's womb. God desires the same relationship with us, that we may hear that still small voice of his in the midst of our circumstances, trusting that he teaches us and leads us. We will become servant leaders, following the path God uses to fulfill his specific purpose for each of our lives. Today, have you considered that you plus God is more than enough to fulfill your God-given purpose and plan? Thanks for listening and being a part of our conversation. You are welcome to pass it on. You can find us at www.debaking.com.